All right, good morning. This is the second of the outside speakers that are funded by the Thomas W. Smith Foundation. Today we have a Duke alum who was very much in the year 2000 in the same position you are now, sitting in my class thinking, when is this going to end? But it never ends. He's back. He graduated in 2004, went to Ireland for a while, came back for Duke Law School for reasons that have never been clear to me. But in spite of that, has managed to be a success in so many different fields. What he's going to talk to us about today is the dark side and the bright side of the sharing economy. But more important, I think he is the living embodiment of the wisdom that you should never let school get in the way of your education. Kesav Mohan.
So thank you for having me here today. If you can't hear me, especially in the back, just give me a thumbs up, and that'll tell me to speak louder. So here are my one request, which is allow me to get through the totality of this presentation before you ask any questions. I try and build my lectures for speed and efficiency. So the talk itself is going to be relatively short, and then the question and answer period is going to be relatively long. Here's what I recommend for questions. In the bottom right-hand corner of every slide, I put a number. That's the slide number. If you have a particular question regarding a slide, write the number down. That'll help us as a point of information when we need to go back as background. So the topic I'm pretty excited to talk to you guys about today is called the dark side of the sharing economy. I think the sharing economy is a kind of this colossal economic, cultural, and social force that's unstoppable. But just because it's unstoppable does not mean that it's all good. I think the benefits of the sharing economy have been covered in the media quite well. I think the dark side has not been covered as well. So that's the purpose of the talk today, is to give you a counterpoint as to why the sharing economy is not all good. So here's the structure of the presentation. First, I'd like to just give you a little bit of background on the sharing economy. Second, we're going to talk about the bright side, summarize the arguments as to why the sharing economy is good, and then the dark side. As this is structured, I'm going to spend a little bit more time on point 3. Again, I think point 2 should be covered well by the media. So let's go to a little bit of background on the sharing economy. What I'd like to do here today is give you my journey into the sharing economy as both a consumer and very soon a professional. Second, I'd like to define 3 economies for you. And then finally, I'd like to give you a definition of the sharing economy and its structure itself. So to give you a little background on my story, a little over 2 years ago, I was in-house counsel and executive at an operating company in Milwaukee. And I was managing what are called 2 sell-side M&A transactions, which is just a fancy legal speak for saying we're selling a bunch of companies. In the major transaction, I interacted a lot with Silicon Valley. Unfortunately, the M&A transaction died. This happens a lot in such deals, but the fire for me to go out west had been lit. So I resigned from my job on good terms with my boss and thought, I'm going to leave Milwaukee, Wisconsin, and I'm going to go to San Francisco. But before I do that, there's a couple things I want to do. This is wing walking. So this is at Sequim, Washington. What you do is you fly 3,000 feet up in the air on a biped plane, and then you climb out on the wings of the plane. It speeds up to 170 miles an hour. And then the plane does aerial acrobatics, barrels, rolls, and something called a hammerhead, where you fly straight to the sun and then down to the ocean. This is alligator wrestling school in Moscow, Colorado. I wrestled 30 alligators. As fun as it sounds as an activity, the real purpose of alligator wrestling school is to check alligators for safety concerns, right? Alligators tend to beat each other up, and so someone has to teach you how to catch the alligators in the wild, and that's why the school was created. This is called the human bungee slingshot. A very wealthy Utah philanthropist on his estate created a unique custom activity. What you do is you have a huge bungee cord and you get pulled back in an ATV, and then the ATV lets you go and you get shot out into the water. This is aerial dogfighting. One of those fun activities I ever did. Me and a law school classmate each got our own pilots and World War II planes, and you chase each other in the air and you play laser tag. This is adult space camp. I never got to go to space camp when I was a kid. Still wanted to go when I was an adult. And fortunately, they replicate the child experience for elderly people like myself. And we get to go basically goof off. This is deep sea fishing in Alaska for halibut. I've never been deep sea fishing. We went to a place called Homer, which is the halibut capital of the world, and got to catch really, really big fish. And then I hung out a lot with animals. This is lion walking in Zambia. These are 2 female lions. Probably have no idea that I'm actually there, but allowed me to hold their tails, and I got to walk them through the wild. This is cheetah walking. I got to race these cheetahs. The cheetah to the right of me in the picture actually bit me, which was not a fun experience. This is wolf walking in Colorado. So just wolves. This is the human jetpack. So you go on a jetpack and you kind of hover above the water. Always something I wanted to do. Get dolphin under the water. This is paragliding in Vallejo. And I finished visiting all 50 states, which I thought was something very important to do as an American. I had 10 left. Pretty common states for people from the state of New Jersey, which are mostly in the West, and then kind of Alaska, Oregon, Montana, over in Mountain Time, etc. Okay, so while I'm traveling all over the world, I need certain things, and I categorize my needs into 3 categories, which are pretty common: housing, transportation, and a 3rd category, which I've combined as food and labor. I also became a participant in 3 different economies, and this is really where the rubber hits the road and where I hit the sharing economy. The first economy I call the social economy, which is you and your friends. The second is the professional economy, the quote-unquote normal economy. And third is the sharing economy. So how do my needs translate in each economy? This is the social economy. Again, myself and my friends, when I need housing, I use my own home or my friend's home. When I need transportation, I would use my car or my friend's cars. And when I need food or labor, I would just cook, or I would eat with my friends, or they would take me to the airport, etc. This is the professional economy. Again, should be pretty intuitive. When I need housing, I went to a hotel or motel. When I need transportation, I would just grab a rental car, or take an airplane, or take public transportation. And when I need food or labor, I would just go to a restaurant or have someone deliver it to me. And this is the social economy. The sharing economy. So the sharing economy is a relatively new phenomenon. Some people say it started a decade ago, but it really didn't start accelerating until about 5 years ago. You may not recognize a lot of these company names. That's okay. But just to give you a sense of the plethora of companies that exist to satisfy various needs, here you go. Airbnb, Couchsurfing, HomeAway for housing. UberX is what I use most. Uber is a top-line company. UberX is one of their products. Lyft, Sidecar, Zipcar to get around. And for food and labor, I use services like Postmates, which are people on bicycles that will go to a particular restaurant that doesn't have its own delivery service and pick up food for you. TaskRabbit, where people will do a wide variety of activities and engage in labor for you. Zirtual, which is a virtual assistant service. And HomeJoy, which is a cleaning service. Okay? These are all examples of sharing economy companies. So what is the sharing economy? This phrase gets thrown around a lot. It's in the media. As I mentioned, it's considered this unstoppable force. I've done a lot of research on this topic. I got to tell you, I don't think anybody knows. You ask 10 venture capitalists what the sharing economy is, you're going to get 10 different answers, and that's okay. The sharing economy is an umbrella structure now. But there are some companies that everybody agrees are sharing economy companies, and some that are on the fence, and some that are hugely in dispute. So what I'm going to do here today is just give you my own definition of the sharing economy. If I had to define the sharing economy in 1 word, it would be access. If I had to define the sharing economy in 6 words, it would be platform access to stuff and labor. And because I'm a lawyer, if I have to define the sharing economy in 6 words plus footnotes, because lawyers put everything in footnotes, I would say platform access to stuff and labor. Footnote number 1, non-professionals often own the stuff and or provide labor. Footnote 2, non-professionals are people that lack the professional certification or license for the core activity of the sharing economy company. And the 3rd footnote, if you remember only one thing from my presentation, it's always read the footnotes, whether it's historical financial statements, forward financial projections, academic articles, etc. So here's a definition of the sharing economy, but I think it's better explained when you look at the structure. Okay, so every sharing economy company follows this simple structure. You start with some stuff and or labor, which is the core good. You put it onto a platform, and the platform has 3 key functions. First, it aggregates the stuff and or labor. Second, it organizes it, right? A very simple way to think about organization is it makes it searchable. And finally, it provides access. And then what does the platform do? It facilitates a transaction between the consumer and or supplier, right? Sometimes between two consumers. And then it takes a fee, which is really important. So when you look at the economic model of how these sharing economy companies make money, it's really at this fee after they facilitate the transaction. So let's look at a couple examples. This is UberX, okay? So what's the stuff in labor? It's car and drivers. What does it do? It aggregates the UberX drivers and the customers. What does it do next? It organizes them by geolocation, their availability, and demand on the customer side. And then it provides access. UberX is primarily done through a mobile app. You can do it through a website, but almost all the user statistics suggest that people just do it on their phone. And then it has the quote-unquote easy button, the one-click call to get the car, and it takes a commission. Here's the Airbnb example, okay? So what do you take? Housing, that's the stuff. You aggregate it, the houses, apartments, the rooms, the couches. You organize them, again, location and availability, access through a mobile app, also through a website. Airbnb tends to be a little bit more website heavy for whatever reason. And then it facilitates a transaction. Easy booking of the housing, and it takes a fee. This is a company called Lending Club. What Lending Club does is it takes people that have money and want to lend it out, and people who need money and need to borrow it, and basically puts them in touch. So the good being organized is capital. What the platform does is that it aggregates the investors and the borrowers, it organizes them through loans, and provides access primarily through a website. And then it facilitates the transaction. Again, easy lending and takes the spread, which is the fee under the financial model. All right, so that in a nutshell is the definition of the sharing economy. So let's talk a little bit about the bright side. What are the benefits of this unstoppable cultural force? I think the arguments can be pretty easily summarized in three categories. The first is you increase supply in any market that a sharing economy enters into. The second is that sharing economy companies are environmentally friendly. And the third is that sharing economy companies provide economic opportunity in the marketplace. Okay, so let's go into these three relatively quickly. So I think the sharing economy is a great example of the benefits of classical supply-side economics. Okay, you don't need to know what that is. What you need to know is that the sharing economy greatly increases the supply in any professional economy. Okay? And then what that ends up doing is that it provides many benefits to the consumers. The core benefit, all things being equal, is that when you take any market and you dump supply into that market, goods or services become cheaper for consumers. So again, here's a couple examples. UberX and Lyft, which are two transportation companies, are increasing the supply of the taxi market. Okay, so if you think of the taxi market very simply as the purpose of the taxi is to take a person from a point of departure and transition them to a point of exit, so to speak. What do UberX and Lyft do? They increase the supply of people that are able to do that, which has led to Uber and Lyft being cheaper than taxis in almost every market in which they all operate. Looking at the housing market, what does Airbnb do? Airbnb takes housing, this good that hotels and motels dominated in the professional economy, and increases the supply. And almost inevitably, you can find cheaper housing in any market that Airbnb exists than the equivalent hotel or motel for the same service. Ditto for Capital and Lending Club. Lending Club is a website where you can almost always get loans cheaper than the location of the borrower of the local banks. Why? Because what Lending Club does is they cut out the middleman, add capital in the market, and provide a cheaper supply of money for anybody who needs it. Okay, that is the increased supply side benefit. So let's talk about the environmentally friendly benefits, right? All the environmental friendly arguments for the sharing economy are based on this phrase, which is called utilization rate. So if you haven't heard this, a simple definition is a utilization rate is the amount of time a good is used over an amount of time it can be used. Okay? So if you think about your house, if anybody here skis, you probably don't ski 365 times a year, which means you're only using your skis a certain amount of days per year over 365, and that is a very simple example of the utilization rate. So why is the sharing economy environmentally friendly? Well, the truth is most stuff has low utilization rates. okay? Your car, your house, your books, your laptop computer. And what the sharing economy does is it increases the utilization rates of goods primarily. And the truth is, the more we use existing goods, the less new stuff we build, and that's environmentally friendly. That's the summary of the argument. So here's an example from a company called Zipcar. I believe there's Zipcar here at Duke. Let's say in a normal economy, you have 10 people and they each have 10 cars and they only use each car 10% of the time. The theory in the sharing economy in this simple example is that you have 10 people with one car and they each use it 10% of the time, which leads to a 100% utilization rate, with the result being that there are 9 cars not produced for the economy, and that's environmentally friendly. So let's talk about economic opportunity. Again, I think this argument is pretty simple to articulate. Many people don't use most of the stuff most of the time. These are called dormant assets. And most people have time, money, time, energy, and inclination. This is excess labor. And the sharing economy turns dormant assets and excess labor into money. Okay, so what it does is it eases transaction costs for you to take your goods and or labor and throw it into the market and have someone pay you for either of those items, right? So here's a recap. This is the summary of the bright side of the sharing economy. Increased supply, environmentally friendly, economic opportunity. So let's talk a little bit about the dark side. I think with any unstoppable cultural force, we're finally reaching a point where people are pushing back in various facets against the sharing economy. The funny thing about the title of my presentation was I came up with it approximately 6 months ago, and then I thought, wow, this is a great title for a presentation. And then the New York Times came out with this exact same title for an article. But at that point, I was clock committed, so didn't want to change the title. But more and more, you're seeing coverage of why the sharing economy has negative effects. Okay, so I need to digress a little bit before I talk about the dark side. And I want to give you a very simple history and explanation of Silicon Valley, which is right now, everybody in Silicon Valley is talking about one word, and that's disruption. Okay, so people are disrupting markets, they're disrupting business models, they're disrupting employee culture. So if you want to be a hip company in Silicon Valley, the word you want to use is disruption. But nobody wants to talk about transition. And I think that's really important. It's all well and good to disrupt things, but you disrupt things, right? And the question is, who's going to handle the transition from one type of economy to another? And the problem with transition really comes around time periods, okay? Economics, let me back up. I think an excellent example of the clash between academics and the real world is in the sharing economy, right? So economics as an academic discipline is really clashing into the real world with society, with the sharing economy clearly in the former camp. You see, both classical economics and the sharing economy believe in a time period called the long run, okay? So they say that everything will be better in the long run. What is the long run? It's forever, basically, okay? Technological progress is inevitable, it's unstoppable, it keeps going, and the long run is this idea that, as long as we keep moving, things will get better and better. And the verbal articulation of the mathematical analysis is, in the long run, the total aggregated future benefits will outweigh the total aggregated future costs, and that is what we call beneficial progress. And I think that's really nice to say, hey, in the long run, things will be better, and perhaps in the long run, eventually, at some point in time in the future, we will be better as a society thanks to the sharing economy. But the problem is, the sharing economy is causing problems right now, in this day and age, 2014. And I think that's what is really the issue, is that these problems are happening today, and these problems are the dark side. It's nice for economics as an academic discipline and sharing economy companies as aggregated consumer entities to say, look, don't worry about it. In the future, everything's going to be fine. But society has to worry about problems right now. And here are the 3 problems that the sharing economy causes for society. The first is FTE to IC. What that means is it's a social and economic phenomenon transitioning full-time employees, FTE, to IC, which is independent contractors. The second is sharing economy really engages in unfair competition in existing markets. And the third is there are safety issues, okay? FTE to IC, unfair competition, safety issues. So I'm going to talk a little bit about labor law, right? I have a rule, having graduated from law school and have been there, which is to talk about law as little as possible, in as simple words as possible. But if anything I say here does not make any sense, again, annotate the slide number down and just let me know, and I'm happy to explain further. Under American labor law, which is this huge category that goes all the way down from towns and localities up to the federal government, there's essentially two types of labor, okay? The first is, again, full-time employee, also referred to as FTE, also referred to as employee, and the second is the independent contractor. The most important thing you need to take away from this slide is that, in general, the default designation in America is you're an independent contractor until you are not. Okay? So the baseline is if there's economic activity between two entities in a market, the person providing the services is an independent contractor unless proven otherwise, in the labor market specifically. There are other labor categories that are irrelevant for this presentation. Okay, so the question is, how do you go from an independent contractor designation to a full-time employee designation? And it's a little complicated. The Internal Revenue Service, known as the IRS, the primary tax body at the federal level, has a 20-factor test to determine if someone is a full-time employee, okay? So some of the factors here are, does the worker take instructions from the business? Does the worker fall under the right to terminate of the business? Does the worker provide oral and written reports to the business, etc.? It's not what's called a hard test. It's not a majority test where if you satisfy 11 of the 20 factors, you are a full-time employee. Rather, how it works is, it's kind of what's called strict scrutiny by the courts, and more particularly the employment government regulatory bodies, where they just look at the scenario and say, yeah, I kind of feel like this is a full-time employee. Life would be easy if it was only this 20-factor complicated test, right? But it's not. There's also something called the Fair Labor Standards Act, which provides classifications for labor and also how people are paid, and states have labor laws, etc. The takeaway you should take from the slide is that it's not that clear under the law what a full-time employee actually is. And sharing economies companies take advantage of this complexity, okay? So let's say we do figure out people can be classified as FTE. Is that a good thing? And I think the argument I want to make for you guys today is that society generally and culturally wants FTE jobs. And that's because there are various actors in an economy, and they all have this desire for FTE jobs for different reasons. So workers want FTE jobs because they get companies to pay some or all of their benefits, right? Health insurance, dental insurance, 401k, paid vacation, maternity leave, etc. The fact that someone else is picking up those costs is a good thing. It provides mental security to full-time employees, it saves them money, provides them additional value, etc. Governments want FTE jobs, and it's really for one reason, which is taxes, right? So if you're a full-time employee, businesses are required to withhold your income tax, and that solves what's called a compliance problem. So I could tell you, John Smith, you have to pay taxes, but if you don't actually pay, I don't actually get my money. And so the way the government has solved this problem is they provided legislation that says, look, businesses, you're required to hold that tax, and then we'll kind of settle up with employees later at the end of the tax year. Additionally, there's a separate category of taxes which would get summarized as payroll taxes. And basically, the point you need to take away here is governments get more money in additional taxes from full-time employees. Third category are vendors, right? Generally, if you have full-time employees, you're either required to buy stuff and or services, or you usually do buy stuff and services. An example on the requirement side is something called workers' compensation insurance. In almost every state, if you have, in every state, if you have over a certain category, a certain number of full-time employees, you're required by law to have workers' compensation insurance, right? So insurance companies want you to have full-time employees because then you're required to buy their products. Examples on the usually could buy side, company car, gas, travel, etc. So there are a bunch of actors who want full-time employees, and kind of everybody thinks it's better for the social fabric of society. What about independent contractors? Well, they don't get a lot of stuff. And the most important thing you need to take away from this slide is they're responsible for almost all of their costs. They're not guaranteed a minimum wage. They have to pay for their own benefits. They have to pay their own taxes. They have to maintain their own insurance, purchase their own vehicles. They have to get their own gas, etc. Okay? So the law says that you, as an independent contractor, are basically your own mini business, and you're responsible for just about everything. So no surprise here, okay? FTE jobs are more expensive than independent contractors. And what we're seeing in the American labor market is this huge transition from full-time employee to independent contractors. And the reason we're seeing this is very simple. You know, people want to save money. Businesses want to save money, so I'd rather have an independent contractor. It's cheaper than actually a full-time employee. And a lot of people are arguing that this transition, FTE to IC, is one of the main reasons the American middle class is disappearing. Okay, so what do sharing economy companies do? So many sharing economy companies classify their labor pools as independent contractors. That's really important. Not all of them, but the vast majority. And the question is why? Well, by classifying the labor pools as independent contractors, sharing economy companies claim that they're not actually employing anybody, but they're merely connecting independent contractors with customers. Remember, sharing economy companies are platforms, right? But the real purpose of this argument, what you should take away, is it's a legal argument to engage in a practice of cost shifting. So what sharing economy companies are doing is they're taking these costs that a normal business, if they had FTE jobs, would incur, and they're moving it onto independent contractors, the suppliers of the goods and or services. And this cost shifting makes stuff cheaper for you and me. But the argument is that it's tearing at the social fabric. The dirty secret of the sharing economy that's not often told in all of the bright side arguments is that the sharing economy companies came up in weak labor markets for the lower and middle economic classes. Okay? So we had an economy post-2008, and some would argue kind of post-2000, where there just weren't a lot of jobs, comparatively, for these two economic demographics. So I think there's a really open question out there, which is, do sharing economy companies really provide economic opportunity, or are they displacing economic opportunity? If sharing economy companies are accelerating the shift from FTE jobs to independent contractor jobs, and if they're doing it for the two labor markets in the lower and middle economic classes, you know, maybe what they're actually doing is making it really, really hard for people to get full-time employee jobs in these two demographics. I think it's a fine line, and the truth is the legal battles are being fought out in the courts right now at almost every level of American government, and it's an ongoing legal debate. So let's talk a little bit about unfair competition, right? Here's the story. Sharing economy companies, again, big word in Silicon Valley, are disrupting existing markets. But markets have rules. And often sharing economy companies are not playing by those rules, okay? So the point of this slide is you and I can play a game, and it'll be really easy for me to win if I don't have to play by all the rules, right? If I can have an unfair advantage in certain categories of behavior or action. So let's take some really simple rules in any economic market. Companies are often required to pay taxes of some sort, depending on the category of economy they exist in. They sometimes need certifications or licenses to engage in that activity, and there's other regulatory burdens that they may have to engage in, environmental burdens, etc. We have rules in markets for reasons, okay? We can argue philosophically as to whether these rules are good or bad, but the general policy reasons are that we need rules for something, okay? So rules don't exist or are not created in a vacuum. We have fire alarms for safety, we have taxes because we need to pay for roads and water and other public goods, and we have certifications for quality, okay? So the general idea is if I certify you in an economic market, I'm doing so because I believe you have a certain quality of good or service, and this is your official recognition by a third-party body that you reach that level of quality. But the unfortunate economic truth is that rules almost always make goods and labor more expensive. Okay, so if you have to play by the rules, you incur costs, and inevitably what you do is you pass those costs on to consumers. So here's the trick. The truth is sharing economy companies get to participate in markets, in existing markets, without paying the existing costs of those rules. Okay? So they go up against professional economy companies. Those professional economy companies have to pay for those rules. The sharing economy companies do not. You remember this slide? So the reason I created this slide was to show you the markets in which each of the sharing economy companies participate in have already existed. So Uber and Lyft in the transportation market, Airbnb in the housing market, Lending Club in the capital market. So there are existing markets that are going into and quote-unquote disrupt them. So the result is, all things being equal, if I don't have to play by the rules as a sharing economy company, my stuff and labor is going to be cheaper than the professional company's stuff and labor. So there's a question here as to whether sharing economy companies are really innovating. You know, to use that word, the second most famous word in Silicon Valley after disruption at the moment, or are they really engaging in a practice called regulatory entrepreneurship? So if you haven't heard this phrase, the idea of regulatory entrepreneurship is basically arbitraging or taking advantage of regulations to make money. Okay, so it's not a model built on innovation in the marketplace with a product. It's regulatory entrepreneurship is taking advantage of laws and regulations to build a capital base. So by avoiding these rules, sharing economy companies push professional economy responsibilities and third-party duties onto non-professionals, which leads to my third point, safety. Okay? Remember, rules have reasons, and one of the biggest reasons in society is we need people to be safe. Sharing economy companies largely move the responsibility of safety in economic transactions from third parties to us. That's a really important point, okay? It's risk shifting to engage in cost shifting. Okay, so many of you may understand the concept of a rating system. You rate your professors, perhaps you've hopped on Yelp, you've rated hotels on TripAdvisor, GoGoBot, or equivalent websites. So rating systems are the most common way that sharing economy companies provide for safety. And the general thesis is drivers over time are rated usually on a very simple 1 to 5 star system. If they have a high rating, we assume from that rating that they're safer. Okay, we assume that past customers of that good or service rated them well, and included in that rating is the theory that that good or service is safe. And the basic idea of rating systems, which sharing economy companies push on us, is we police ourselves. Okay, and this is great, right? I think no, actually not. So it turns out that safety isn't just one thing. It's not just a rating system. It's not even, it's not just reputational capital, which is the basis of any rating system, nor is it background checks. So many sharing economy companies, which use independent contractors, do use background checks. The truth is, safety is a lot of things, right? So let's go through a couple examples. In London, you have the most competitive taxi driver exam in the world. It's a test called the Knowledge, okay? So if you want to drive a cab in London, you have to basically memorize the city of London, you have to memorize the traffic patterns. It's such a difficult task that there have been neuroscience studies that have shown that the portion of the brain that is used to study for this exam is enlarged in taxi cab drivers, okay? That's how much they're studying. It takes 2 to 5 years to study for this exam, and about 12 attempts to actually pass it. But to the third point, if you're an Uber X driver in London, you don't have to take this exam. What about vehicle quality? Okay, so in San Francisco, taxis are required to retire if they hit 325,000 miles. In the city of San Jose, they're required to retire if they hit 400,000 miles. In Atlanta, if the vehicle reaches an age of 5 years. In Seattle, if they reach an age of 7 years. But you know what Uber X says when you're driving your own car? It just says your vehicle has to be in excellent condition, and you have to own your car with proper insurance. So are those equivalent standards of safety? I would argue they're not. Let's go back to Airbnb. So hotels have lots of rules. right? You need to have fire alarms on site and a certain amount of staff, and food has to be of a certain quality in the restaurant. But Airbnb says we're not a hotel provider. We're just a platform between vendors / independent contractors and customers. So none of this really applies to us. I think the core safety challenge that you're seeing in the sharing economy is very simple to articulate. You're trying to apply local standards of safety, right? Standards that happen here in Durham, in the county, in the state of North Carolina, even at the federal level, and you're trying to apply it to global sharing companies. The last time I checked these websites, Uber was in 220 cities. Airbnb is in 34,000 locations. So it's not easy, right? So what do these companies want to do? Well, to reduce their own costs from a regulatory perspective, they engage in a series of arguments. The first argument is that, hey, we as a sharing economy are exempt from the rules. And if that doesn't work, then it says, hey, we as a sharing economy are not really responsible for your rules. We're just a platform. So what we're going to do is say, not our fault. If you need drivers regulated, you need to actually go blame our independent contractors and make sure that their standards of quality, that's your responsibility, government, not ours. If you are worried about the quality of our housing on our website, you need to go visit each of those 34,000 cities and check to make sure that the person is providing a quality of hotel experience for Airbnb, Postmates with labor, et cetera, et cetera. And if that argument doesn't work in locality, inevitably what you're seeing is what I call old school politics, which is sharing economies are going into lobbying and striking deals. Okay? So they strike deals at various levels. One deal that just came out, for example, is a sharing economy company called Sidecar, which is sort of this third, fourth place company in the transportation market, just struck a deal with the San Francisco airport to be the only ride-sharing company to be able to take people to and from the airport. So airports make a lot of money on various fees and licenses from taxi cab companies to take people to primarily from the airport, but sometimes to. And Sidecar struck a deal to knock the other guys out of the market. So sharing economy companies can no longer call themselves startups. They're engaging in some really strong political moves, lobbying and striking deals. So what I would encourage all of you to do when you use the sharing economy company, and by the way, I'm a huge proponent of the sharing economy company. I use Uber or Lyft twice a day in San Francisco. I use Airbnb all the time. Is just understand the risks, right? So these companies get to play in these markets without abiding by the same rules. And if I had to guess from a regulatory perspective, this is going to change. So here's the summary again. FTE to IC, unfair competition, and safety. So again, I like to give fast presentations and leave more time for question and answers. Here's my contact information with my email. As I mentioned to you in the beginning of the presentation, I really believe in the sharing economy, so much so that I have joined the sharing economy company called VeniumWorks, and I start on Monday. So there's my big announcement. I'm happy to tell you about VeniumWorks. It's a little bit in stealth mode, but it has amazing technology being tested in 600 buses in Portugal, and my job will be to bring this technology into the US market. And I have to mitigate a lot of these concerns I've raised for you today. So this is not just academic for me, it's a practical, forward-looking presentation. That's the totality of everything I have. I'm open for questions.
All right, if you were to ask the question, let me ask you to repeat the question so we get it.
Okay. Okay, so the question, I'm going to summarize it, is how do you act more safely in the sharing economy? It's a great question, and I think the answer is to rely more on your social economy. Okay, so what my friends have done in the city of San Francisco, which is kind of ground zero for the sharing economy, is when they are able to do so, they rely upon their friends on top of the sharing economy for goods and services. So Airbnb, a lot of my friends no longer go to the Airbnb site and actually search for housing. The first thing they do is they post on Facebook or Twitter or Google+, although I don't really know that many people who use Google+, and ask, hey, do you have any recommendations for housing in the city of Birmingham, Alabama? on Airbnb, they get listings, and that's how they actually do the search. So it's a secondary level search relying upon past wisdom. I actually think if you're serious about it, you should follow the lobbying activities very carefully. Okay, so more and more, and I think the best example comes in the car driving space. More and more governments are saying you need to provide a certain amount of quality control, including safety. And so it's just more certifications, it's more licenses, which is interesting, right? Because the derivative point of your question is the more costs that are added, the less supply is in the market. So drivers are starting to drop out of Uber and Lyft. And the less drivers you have, the more cost of the good gets, right? So it's a spiral that goes in either direction.
What's like the pushback from the institutions of the professional economy, like taxpayers and like hotels, are they trying to lower their costs, or they just like arguing that the government should be regulating the sharing economy better?
Okay, so the question is, and tell me if I misstated, what is the pushback from professional economy companies against the sharing economy companies? The answer is a lot, okay, and it varies by market. I think the taxi cab companies have been really fortunate and or politically astute to rely on monopolistic markets, right? So taxi companies tend to operate locally, and so they work with local government, and they've had this monopoly, and the way that they were regulated was through something called set prices, largely, right? So if everybody understands the concept of surge pricing, you really don't have surge pricing in the taxi market, with the theory being these taxi rates are set by the local government, right? So the taxis are complaining that this regulation is now inhibiting them from competing. Hey, we used to be, the only game in town, and we had a set price, but now these guys are coming in and undercutting us. That's counterbalanced by an argument, which is, oh, but we also have all these costs. We have to buy a taxi medallion sometimes. We have to be certified. Our vehicles have to be certain quality. And these guys don't have to have that. So that's not fair. So they're going to battle on the political battlefronts as well. And so the story of the sharing economy companies that is not being told is that they're building up their lobbying efforts all across the world because they are facing pushback. I think in the hotel industry, you're seeing the same sort of movement of like, hey, we have to worry about food quality, we have to worry about fire alarms, we have to have a certain amount of doors, but this guy, Bob, with his house, doesn't have to worry about any of this stuff. And so there's really a push to say, let's go after that. Airbnb is interesting, and HomeAway and the equivalent in the housing market, because there are now political arguments, I don't know if they're backed by data, that these companies are taking out long-term housing. Okay, so that there's landlords who say, look, I have an apartment, I'm going to make more money putting it on Airbnb and renting it to short-term rentals than I am a long-term rental, and that's really killing housing supply. Now, if there's a lot of housing, nobody cares, but in a city like San Francisco, which just surpassed Manhattan as the most expensive housing market in the country, it's a really, really big deal, right? So Airbnb is really fighting against, the local Airbnb and the apartment owners are fighting against regulatory bodies for housing for lower and middle economic classes.
Do you think sharing economy companies have capabilities to entirely manufacture companies?
Could you repeat your question?
Sure. Do you think sharing economy companies have capabilities to entirely, wipe out professional economy companies?
Okay, so the question was, do sharing economy companies have the capability to wipe out and or absorb professional economy companies? I think the answer is yes to both, okay? So here's an example of absorbing them. Uber has a product called Uber Taxi, right? So what it does is it takes the technology on the phone and allows you to call a taxi. Before Uber or equivalent service, you have to pick up the phone and call someone, right? So what Uber does is it sees where there's Uber taxis, here are the taxis that are around for you if you want a taxi versus another service, and you can call them. Do I think they have the capability to wipe these out? Yes, I do, and it's really a size game, okay? Uber's in 220 cities, each taxi company is in one place, maybe two, right? So just by size of economics, I think they have a chance to take out the professional economy companies.
Question about safety. You talked about risks being transferred onto the consumers or the independent contractors. You also talked about how the rating system might not cover all of these risks, give information about them. Can you talk more specifically about which risks you think aren't covered by the rating system that would be serious if transferred onto consumers?
Yeah, so the question was, when you see the risk shifting as a practice of cost shifting, what are specific risks that are dangerous for consumers and or independent contractors in each market? Did I articulate well?
And not covered by the ranking system that you would think would cover a lot of those.
And not covered by the ranking system. Yeah, I think I'm going to go back to a couple examples I have. One is vehicle age, right? So when I rate an Uber driver, I have no idea as to the quality of the vehicle. Really the only thing I can rank is I got from point A to point B, and the person was relatively pleasurable, right? But I could have been riding in a dangerous car and just not know. That's not covered, right? Ditto for housing, right? So there's an old saying that I learned in Duke Law School, which is like nobody celebrates the bad things that do not happen to you. And there's sort of a whole legal argument that comes from that. I think that's an example of, we believe that a third-party body, the government certification, is there to certify things that we may not have knowledge about, right? So with hotels, it's like, hey, all of the fire alarms work, or the gas stove is safe, or the electricity is always on, etc., right? And that's really the point of a lot of these regulatory bodies. But when you go to a rating system, Airbnb is not certifying, right? Airbnb is not going to each house and saying, well, there are enough doors, the emergency, the fire extinguisher works, right? They don't actually check that information. And I don't think a lot of these risks are captured in a rating system in any way, shape, or form that encourages safety.
To what extent does the sharing economy reflect the values and aspirations of the millennial generation?
So the question is, to what extent does the sharing economy respect the values or aspirations of the millennial generation? The short answer is a lot. I think the millennial generation is really driving the sharing economy. So what we're finding in the millennial generation, and to some extent the generation before, is people are moving towards this idea of a rental economy. And the rental economy in the modern 2014 era is based on one simple concept, which is if I have universal access to the item, I get the same benefits as if I own the item. Okay? So think about services you use on a day-to-day basis. With Spotify, if any of you guys use Spotify or equivalent, radio service like Pandora, you don't actually own any of the music. What you have is a license to access the music universally at any day or time that you have internet access. Okay? And to some extent, with services like Spotify, you can download or cache the song and even be offline and still have access to it. But you don't own it, right? And I think that's been the big mental shift driven by the millennial generation is it's okay not to own stuff. As long as I have continuous universal access to that item, I don't need to actually purchase it, right? You see this with homes. So, wow, if I can rent a castle on Airbnb, which I can, do I really need to own a castle, right? Or a second vacation home, or etc. So this idea of universal access to goods as the equivalent of the benefits of ownership is really driving a lot of the sharing economy.
Do you think there are certain environments that are not ready for the sharing economy?
So the question was, do I think there are certain environments that are not ready for the sharing economy?
Or are they not?
It's a great question. I don't have a full answer, so I'm going to answer it partially. I think first, the sharing economy, many people argue, was the original economy. Okay, so long ago when we were tribes, we shared stuff. Okay, so some people argue, and I don't know if it's actually that good of an argument. I haven't examined it that well, but to say, look, the sharing economy is the way things used to be. So to some extent, it's innate in our culture, right? But I do believe that it won't take root in some places. I think places that tend to focus on ownership tend to be more capitalistic, tend to be wealthier, right? Remember that the economic classes that the sharing economy sells to and sells from tend to be lower middle economic classes. So you won't, the simple way to put it is you just won't find as many $1 million homes on Airbnb as you would couches, right? So there is kind of a demographic resistance to the sharing economy. But for the most part, as we see cultural shifts towards rental, for the most part, as we see cultural shifts towards people needing to make an extra side income in a tough economy at certain levels, I do believe this is an unstoppable force.
One more question?
You related to the labor consequences of the shared economy. but I was wondering, so in your summary you state that the real consequences are with regard to risk and security. And I was wondering, what do you think does it mean with regard to people not only as consumers but as to workers? So if we are all a part of this share economy, what does it mean with regard to future employment and our ability to purchase these goods in the future? So you said you related to the dire economic situation that currently happens, therefore it's pushing for it. But it is based on people who are still earning high wages, and so can consume these relatively lower priced goods. What if we all become workers in this type of economy?
It's a great question. So to summarize, it's, and I'm going to paraphrase slightly, but what are the true negative effects on labor, both as the ability to earn revenue and the ability to purchase goods and services in the market? I saw this TED Talk by a venture capitalist, and it's one of the more popular TED Talks because it's one of the more controversial ones. And I forget his name, so forgive me, but he made an argument that I think made a lot of sense to me on the buy side of your question. And he said, look, I am extremely wealthy, but at the end of the day, I can only buy one haircut, and I can only eat so much food, right? And I can only stay in one place. I can have multiple houses, but I can only live in one place, and I only can wear so many jeans. And the argument he was trying to make was, you know, we need a robust middle class to buy stuff. We need them to buy a certain category of goods that you can't scale with more money, right? I can't get any more haircuts no matter how richer I get, right? So I think it's a huge problem on the buy side. If people don't have the capacity to buy goods and services, they're stuck, right? Now on the supply side, in terms of getting income, I go back to my first phenomenon, which is this very, very scary shift of full-time employee to independent contractor. Businesses are making rational economic decisions, but they're scary for the social fabric, which is I'm not going to hire full-time employees. I'm going to rely upon independent contractors to drive my business. I see it a lot in the Valley with startup companies, more and more as technology makes the transaction cost of communication lower. People are making a rational decision of, why should I take on all the health costs? Why should I take on all the insurance costs, the extra benefit costs? You know what, I'm just going to hire independent contractors in India, Africa, the Caribbean, South America, pay them separately, right? Or independent contractors in the US, refuse to give them a full-time job. And people are making less money, right? Because the amount of money, they have to back all of their costs out of the money they earn, as opposed to having a company share some of that burden. So I think it's a scary phenomenon on both sides of the equation.
So because there is this shift from full-time employees to independent contractors, do you think the full-time employees will be left with no choice but to sort of make that shift and just change, I guess, their professions or do whatever they need to adapt?
Yeah, so the question was, are full-time employees going to be forced to shift to independent contractor status? I'm not dodging your question. I just think it's a complicated answer. I think some full-time employees, especially in lower economic jobs or middle-class jobs, will be forced into that transition, right? So the offer on the table is not, hey, you either will have a full-time employee job or an independent contractor job. The offer is an independent contractor position or no position whatsoever. You're also seeing what I call duration issues, right? Which is, hey, I'd like to bring you on as an independent contractor for 6 months or for a year to quote-unquote test you out before I convert you over to full-time employment status, right? And that's a relatively new phenomenon. You know, we've certainly had internships for a while, although the legal basis for unpaid internships is being challenged. But companies with adults outside of the educational experience are being told, look, we'll bring you on as an independent contractor for a very, very long time. And they're getting better and better at kind of running around the 20-factor test put forth by the IRS. So they're feeling more and more comfortable legally doing that. Now, you're seeing a backlash, right? And this happened with outsourcing. We used to outsource everything to Asia. And now we're bringing a lot of stuff back, insourcing, right? Not everything, but a lot of stuff. And what we found is that, yes, the raw labor costs are cheaper in Asia or in South America, but we have additional costs with communication, which quality, and so it's actually, when you factor in full-time employment, sometimes it's cheaper. You got to remember the sharing economy does not operate in a vacuum. It's very much pushed forward by technology. So that's another problem. Technology is another trend that's taking out a lot of jobs, right? Instagram sold for $1 billion. I think they had maybe 20 employees, WhatsApp sold for something like $19 billion. I think they only had like 15 employees or something ridiculous like that, right? Pre-1980, even pre-1990, you really never saw $19 billion companies with 20 employees. But the idea is that technology can create company economic value without labor. And so the sharing economy is crashing into this technological evolution, and it's really, really scary for labor.
You mentioned that you use companies like Airbnb and Uber all the time, but what responsibility do you feel like consumers have for the societal damage that you talked about during your presentation that sharing economy companies create?
So the great question is, what responsibility do consumers have for the damage done by sharing economy companies? Did I articulate well? I don't know, right? And I think consumers make economic rational choices, and they're going to Airbnb because it's cheaper, right? In the same way that consumers make environmentally rational decisions that are economic, right? So I choose to drive my car, versus something that's more environmentally friendly because it gets me to where I need to go faster, right? And so it's a commons problem, right? If you've heard that term. I don't know. I think the real responsibility for consumers is not as consumers, but as political entities and specifically voters. So if as a society we believe that the sharing economy is causing damage that needs to be rectified, then as a voter we need to go talk to political entities and impose regulation to right that ship.
You keep talking about how it's scary that the labor market is going to be negatively impacted with the sharing economy, but if it reduces the need for those jobs, wouldn't the other sectors just compensate by adding more jobs and expanding in other markets?
Great question. So the question is, I keep using the phrase scary or scary phenomenon for the transition of FTE to IC. Will other labor markets in the economy pick up the jobs that are lost? The empirical evidence is no. Okay, and it has to do with two facts. Again, technology is making the workers more productive, dramatically more productive, and so that's taking out jobs. And the second is, the truth is, as we add technology, and specifically the internet to every industry, we are commoditizing and then removing jobs at the lower level, which are unfortunately where the volume of jobs exists. Okay, so an excellent example I use is kind of fast food companies, right? So more and more what you're seeing is when you go to your local fast food restaurant and you give your order at the drive-thru here in North Carolina, that actual order is being taken by somebody in Utah or Montana or somewhere else, right? Because what we found is that through technology, you just have to give your order and someone in the middle of the United States, usually in a time zone that's more accessible, can take the order and take advantage of economics, but those jobs are not being replaced, right? So if we have one person taking orders in 10 different locations, we haven't created those 9 other job spots. And that's the unfortunate reality of the world we live in.
What are the implications of the sharing economy for manufacturing? If we increase the utilization rate, are we going to decrease the number of cars produced, electronics, et cetera?
So the question was, what are the ramifications of the sharing economy for manufacturing? The theory, and I haven't seen any data to prove this, but the theory is we will reduce the production of goods the more these goods are used in the sharing economy. Like if we use Airbnb more, we're going to have less houses built. If we have people who take Uber and Lyft, and specifically Zipcar more, we're going to have people buy less cars. I don't know if that's true, but that's sort of the general argument that's being outlined.